For a story of this period of history, it certainly still resonates with a very modern feel. A family drama like no other, one full of ambition, cruelty, betrayal, desperation, and love lies hidden to the fates of Henry VIII's wives. It is a political story of such fundamental importance to England's advancement as a sovereign country. It continues to be the opening and often the last history lesson we teach our children. Anne, who was the second wife of Henry, is the protagonist. She is still recognised as the most remarkable woman of her age. In May of this year, it was 486 years since this lady was beheaded in the Tower of London. The last days of her life have been told numerous times in that period. So join me now as we look at the latest evidence to suggest the Queen was far more notorious than we've ever been told, as new information comes to light on the tragic life of Anne Boleyn. And please like the video and consider subscribing for more historical stories. Our story opens with a dramatic account of the day in question, one that could have been lifted from any recent Tudor documentary. But the scenes we see are just the start of a more comprehensive investigation. Although this was shocking at the time, distraught courtiers rushing through cold palace corridors provided the backdrop for an engaging argument over how much we know about this significant crisis of the Tudor era. Prominent historians and, more contentiously, authors from the time of the Tudor period have contributed their thoughts to this discussion. Scholarly voices include David Starkey, Susanna Lipscomb and G.W. Bernard, Hilary Mantel, author of Wolf Hall, and Philippa Gregory, author of The Other Boleyn Girl, are the two leading ladies of Tudor literature. Yet, evidently, they only sometimes see eye to eye. Firstly, let's review that build-up and fateful day. Anne Boleyn was Henry VIII's queen from 1533 until her death on May 19, 1536. Her father was Thomas Boleyn, Viscount Rochford and later Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond. Anne was beautiful, intelligent, French-educated and sophisticated. At a young age, Anne was secretly betrothed to Henry Percy, heir to the earldom of Northumberland, a union that would have made her the de facto Queen of the North. But her luck changed when she grabbed the notice of Henry VIII. The king's long marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed sexually and dynastically, so he had begun looking elsewhere for recreation and a new queen. Anne kindly supplied it, but for a king's ransom, and the unsettling rift between England and the Church in Rome was the price she paid to keep her throne. It would be difficult to exaggerate Anne's daring in pulling off her revolution. David Starkey said, "Think about the thought that someone like her could topple the marriage of the King of England to the Princess of Spain. People in 1509 would have looked at you like you were crazy if you'd said something like that to them." But it was the first time an English monarch had ever divorced. Even the French King Louis XII did this only after striking a deal with the Vatican. But it's essential to appreciate how shattered things got once Anne did her thing. The king wed the daughter of a lowly nobleman in January of 1533, and his first marriage was declared null and void in May of the same year. Anne was crowned on June the 1st, 7 months pregnant, carrying the future Elizabeth I. But her death came in fewer than 3 years. So why do you suppose that is? It is the big question that her final days pose. There are many perspectives, as there are authors. According to one, the king turned to Jane Seymour after a string of miscarriages which exposed Anne to the monarch's wandering eye. He clarified that he wanted to rid her by whatever means necessary. And yet Thomas Cromwell, the chief minister, plotted against Anne because of their conflicts, her seeming hold on the king, and her inclination to intervene in state affairs. Bernard proposed a third possibility, that Anne was guilty of adultery, incest and treason, all of which contributed to her execution. Another option is that Henry just goes mad, as expressed by Gregory. The man becomes a little crazy. Within these final days of Anne, we should consider all these options, but not settle on a single explanation. It does seem quite risky and one above any certainty. But it's not as risky as putting novelists and historians on an equal footing in what is described as a historical dispute, though because the explanations for Anne's death and existence are based on intuition due to a lack of concise information, it's at this point where the story could fall apart. Gregory thinks Anne is interesting to study because she serves as an historical mosaic on which most people can imprint their unique ideas and beliefs. Gregory said she is a typical example of a renowned woman, where the picture you have of her informs you what the historian believes about women. She continues, according to your preconceived notions, she is either the whore or a near saint. Fixing her up gets intensely personal. You must already have formed an opinion on the weight of the historical evidence before you begin to examine it. As for Starkey, he finds this completely preposterous. He argues that we should cease treating writers of historical fiction as though they were actual historians. Insisting that they hold any power is a complete farce. They have a knack for visualizing characters, which is why their works are so famous. When it comes to dealing with historical documents, however, they have no credibility. He argues Henry VIII's wives are too important to be relegated to clickbait. Their significance lies in how they affect the bigger picture of the period and the history of every person who ever lived in England at the time and in the future. So was Anne an icon of feminism or historical giant? The second option seems more likely. On the other hand, Anne has never been the type to lend herself to a detached examination. The most recent biographer, American academic Susan Bordeaux, argues that she could only channel Anne's emotions on the day of her execution because she was run over by a bicycle. It's frustrating for historians because Anne Boleyn's legend persists just as fiercely as the truth. She's just as polarising as she was before she lost her life. But now the new proof that Anne Boleyn had multiple encounters while still married to Henry VIII has surfaced in a poem describing her unfaithful behaviour. The second queen was executed because she was accused of having sexual relations with 5 men, including that of her brother. Historians have claimed that she was framed by those loyal to Catherine of Aragon, the first queen, or that Henry invented the accusations because he was denied a son. Still, a poem composed in France just days after her death in 1536 has cast doubt on these theories. Tudor historian Bernard claims that musician Mark Smeaton, courtier Henry Norris, head of the King's Chamber, and Boleyn's brother George were all named in the 1,000-line poem by Lancelot de Carle, secretary to the French ambassador to England. It's a poem that pulls no punches and calls Anne a common whore. Despite the poem's reputation as a literary work and undeserving of credit, Professor Bernard claims he has found evidence to substantiate its contents in letters and other documents from the time. Bernard names the Queen's Privy Chamber lady, Elizabeth Somerset, the Countess of Worcester. She's quoted in the poem as noting that her promiscuous behaviour paled to that of her monarch, who was sleeping with her brother. Her claims against Anne were more believable because of their close relationship. According to Bernard, Anne's lady-in-waiting would have not only been aware of it, but more likely to have been complicit in adulterous deeds. Elizabeth testified against Anne Boleyn in 1536, saying the Queen had committed multiple acts of adultery with several men, including courtier Henry Norris, musician Mark Smeaton, and the Queen's brother George Boleyn, 2nd Viscount Rochford. Yet this written work has brought what some say is the truth to the table. It exposes the tension and lifts the lid on one of the most, if not most, scandalous periods in Henry's reign. Lancelot de Carle's poem continues. This is in its translated form. After being cautioned by her brother, the counsellor's sister, who showed her not to appear promiscuous, declared, "I'm not the greatest offender when it comes to promiscuous behaviour, but you do detect a minor fault in me, while disregarding a much bigger problem that is much more devastating. The Countess then says, "I must not fail to mention what seems to me to be the worst part, which is that her brother has sexual knowledge of her in bed." Although many historical records agree that the claims concerning incest between Anne and George are trumped up, the evidence given would all lead to the demise of Anne. Agent of the Lord Deputy of Calais, John Hussey, claimed, "As to the Queen's accusers, my Lady of Worcester is reported to be the principal." This statement alone confirms that Elizabeth Somerset was the Privy Councillor's sister mentioned in the poem. Smeaton and Norris were mentioned in the poem as being seduced by the Queen's kisses and hugs. Eventually, it all led to 3 men and 2 courtiers who were tried and beheaded for carnal love of the Queen on May 17, 1536. Hilary Mantel says that Anne's supporters hate anyone who says this, but it is possible that she did have affairs. The allegations seem wildly implausible to us, but clearly did not seem so at the time. It is the incest allegation that seems lurid overkill, but the 16th century did not invest incest with this special loathing. It was one of a range of sinful sexual choices. This evidence has now been made public, but it will enlighten everyone who reads it or infuriate the believers that Anne was framed, and nothing can argue against that. Bernard said, "Experts have said it's ridiculous to think a queen would do something so outrageous as to commit adultery. However, if the Queen's women were in on it, it's not so hard to imagine how it happened." Although David Starkey maintains that Anne Boleyn was not sexually immoral, he said, "What Professor Bernard has to say will definitely have some value. This man is a deadly serious academic with an incredible depth of period knowledge." During the events of Anne's investigation, which took place in the spring of 1536, Elizabeth Somerset was 7 months pregnant. While still imprisoned in the Tower, Anne felt concerned about her former lady-in-waiting's complications because her infant did not stir in her body, and she much regretted my Lady of Worcester. Yet while Anne Boleyn was still languishing in jail, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, which she christened Anne. Regardless of how you interpret the evidence, it is undeniable that she was not only the controversial wife, but one that actively participated in this period. She performed her historical role, and many will say, in reality, she changed history. Susanna Lipscomb has said the love affair between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is shrouded in historical myth, romantic legend, cliché, and half-truths. Much of their story remains fiercely debated by historians, everything from why Henry fell for Anne to why he destroyed her in the end. Yet every generation discovers its Anne Boleyn, and every generation also debates her. Shakespeare acknowledged at the end of Henry VIII that "'tis 10 to 1 this play can never please all that are here." He was the expert on historical drama of all time, and he was quite possibly correct. However, I think that this Anne Boleyn is still relevant today, and then even tomorrow.